Today I'm receiving my Felder K500 professional saw. The gentleman delivering the saw was very nice to bring it up the driveway and into my shop after he unloaded it from the truck, as I think he's only obligated to take it off the truck and bring it to the end of the driveway. We got it into position in the shop, as I knew I had to take advantage of his pallet jack to get it where I wanted to unpack it. Once he left, I'd really have no way to move it around.
First one set over here. Oh, there's a wheel kit for it.
The saw came on a pallet made of 2x4s. It had a frame built for the sides and the top with heavy plastic attached to enclose the saw. All of the accessories were packed very securely onto the pallet. I was very impressed with the packaging, as everything was screwed down so it wouldn't move around at all. There was absolutely no damage to anything, which is really impressive with how many parts came with the machine. Before I started assembling the saw, I laid out all the parts to take a quick look and just an inventory to make sure I knew what I was getting into. At this point, I realized I was going to need to figure out a lot of the assembly on my own, as the instructions have a new meaning of vague. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot of paperwork from diagrams to parts lists, but nothing detailed about the assembly. This is the pallet that the saw guard came on. It was delayed a couple of weeks, but I was just happy to have it arrive. Again, top-notch packaging, no damage to any of the parts that came from Austria to Delaware, then over to me in Indianapolis. You can tell the quality of all these parts. Just the weight of the parts alone and the thick material it's made out of feels really nice compared to any other saw I've ever had. The mobility kit's nice, rugged, well thought out, except for the small detail that Felder missed when I ordered the machine. The K500 was not designed for a mobility kit. Yes, really. I need to be able to move the machine around my shop, so Felder and I decided that I'd just figure out how to mount it myself. Not really sure what else I would do besides return the machine, and that's not really what I wanted to do. It all worked out really well, as parts ended up fitting well, almost like it was designed for it. I started by drilling holes for the wheel assemblies. I utilized a hole on each side of the machine already there for the leveling feet. Then I attached the wheel assembly underneath the lower part of the base. I aligned the wheel assemblies, tightened everything up, set the machine down, and started attaching the front lifting bar assembly. Once I figured the height for the front lifting bar hitch, I drilled the holes and bolted it on. I had to be careful because there were two large capacitors mounted just inside the frame, and I had to make sure I missed both of them. I gave it a test lift and was happy that everything lifted up well and I didn't have any issues with mounting the mobility kit. The lifting bar has a nice locking bar feature that once lifted, you can't let the machine fall back onto the floor. Now I can move the machine off the pallet onto the floor. Removing the plastic from the slider might have been one of the most satisfying parts of the setup. When the saw is shipped, there are a couple of plastic wedges between the slider and the base. It was really nice to get those bits out so I could finally play with the slider. The table slides so far that you'd think it'll fall off the end of the table. It won't, though. These are all the parts that are laid out and ready to go together. The end caps just mount right on the end of the slider. They have little wipers to clean off the sawdust as the slider moves. outrigger table just sits on the arm and slides in the table. There's a cam lever that lets you position the outrigger wherever you want on the slider. Everything has stops so you can't push the sliding table off the base. The crosscut fence just slides onto the outrigger table with a pivot bolt and a slotted keyway on the outer end for angle adjustments. The table extension bar is super heavy and just mounts to the cast iron table with studs that are already installed from the factory. The table extension supports mount in the slots on the side of the case. There are height adjustment bolts that have little felt dots attached to the head of the bolt to go between the bolt and the table. Once I got the first extension loosely installed, I used a couple of straight edges to properly flush up the tops. It was pretty straightforward with all the adjustment bolts. I mounted the last extension and flushed this up as well. At this point, with the table extensions and the outrigger, this thing kind of started to look like a spaceship. It's pretty cool. The guide to the rip fence just slides onto the table over some bolt heads. The guide for the rip fence is super solid. It has rollers on the bottom side and slides really easy. The rip fence itself can mount two ways. You can also turn it 90 degrees, which works well when you need clearance for an angled cut. The blade installation is very different from a standard table saw. The guard slides out of the way, and the blade mounts on an arbor with two pins. The bolt's then used to clamp the blade in place. Here I'm using a Ridge Carbide 12-inch blade. There's a scoring unit on this saw. When the scoring unit is used, you need a 10-inch blade so it doesn't interfere with the scoring blade itself. There's a safety switch that keeps the saw from turning on when the blade guard is moved out of the way for the blade changes. Installing the overhead saw guard was interesting since there were no instructions or diagrams to go by, although once I started to figure it out, it really was a clever design. I freestyled a little bit like tapping and bolting the main arm to the support bracket because it had a little bit of a wobble. After I did this, it was pretty solid though. It was just 4 bolts to install the saw guard head on the support arm. It was way heavier than I ever thought it would be. There is a gas strut on the saw guard head itself that makes it really easy to adjust it up and down. It really is nice and smooth. At this point I just needed to connect all the dust hose lines and get ready to take it for a test drive.